I spend a lot of time in that DTC, which direct to consumer, e-commerce, retail space. The Wayfair decision really impacted these companies significantly. So they have a lot more filing obligations now than they ever have. In talking to these potential and even existing clients, it really comes down to three parts. Where do I have filing obligations? What do I need to do with any exposures that I might have created? And exit strategy. What do I need to do with managing this risk and exposure that I might have when it comes to an exit strategy for my business? The first part of this, the filing obligations, is all about economic nexus to a large extent now. But let's be clear, the physical present standards that were in effect prior to Wayfair, they're still on the books. A company has to consider where they have physical property, whether it's real or personal property. If property is in their third-party logistics or 3PL warehouse, they have to consider where that inventory is located. The other piece of that physical presence analysis is the employee side. And with the pandemic and that whole shift of people going to a remote work environment really changed the company's people profile and where their employees are located. So a company has to consider that now when they're looking at their Nexus footprint. You also have to consider all of your sales channels. These direct-to-consumer or D2C e-com retailers, they have their own platform like a Shopify or WooCommerce, and they might have their inventory with the 3PL in a Texas warehouse, for example. But you also have to consider if you're selling through a marketplace like Amazon or Etsy, you need to understand where your inventory is located. If you're a part of the FBA program in Amazon, for example, you might have inventory in 20 or 30 states wherever their fulfillment centers are. That creates nexus in most of those. FBM, that's not really an issue. It's more about where your inventory is with the 3PL. So the other piece of looking at the nexus part of this, where do you have filing obligations? You have to consider the measure, the base. Most of the states base your nexus thresholds on gross sales. That's everything, right? That's services, that's all of your retail activity, that's your wholesale activity. And that's one of the areas that I feel like clients are struggling to comprehend. More often than not, a client will run their wholesale activity through a different platform. It's not even going to the tax calculation engine in a lot of instances. But you have to consider the gross sales in most of the states. You also have to consider the certificate piece of this. If you don't have an exemption certificate, even though you might not have charged tax, if you don't have the certificate, a state is going to look at that as a retail sale, not a wholesale sale, because you don't have the document to support it. One word of caution here though. A lot of the software first companies in their tax calculation engines have a heat map as it relates to Nexus. And there are a lot of the direct to consumer retailers that I work with that really leverage and use that heat map to guide them on where they have these filing obligations. It's a good start. It depends on how integrated your entire sales process is with that tax calculation engine. For example, if your company is not running the wholesale activity, if it's not calling the tax calculation software, obviously those sales are not being counted or considered. And for a state that bases their thresholds on gross sales, you're missing that picture. You're missing all of those transaction counts and you're missing all of those sales dollars. So it's a good start, but that's about where it should stop. So the next piece of what I hear from these direct-to-consumer retailers pretty often is, All right, so I have all these filing obligations now. Do I have exposure? And if I do, what should I do about it? Well, you really got about 3 options. You can do nothing. It's not advised, but you can do nothing. You can bury your head in the sand, and maybe you reserve for it or not, but you don't do anything to address the retroactive exposure, and you don't do anything to register and file going forward. It's not advised. We certainly don't advise it, but it is an option. A second option is to really address the prior exposure, and that's typically done with a voluntary disclosure, where we bring you forward anonymously to the state. We say they have nexus, they didn't realize it, we want to come forward. We remit that prior obligation, that past obligation, and you're registered to file, collect and file prospectively. The third option is to just register to file prospectively. You might reserve that balance from your exposure on your balance sheet, and you just monitor it. At that point, with this option, you're just registering now to start filing, and you're essentially saying, I'll take that chance if they come knocking on the door. There are states that are more aggressive than others. Most people know that. There are some that are just very aggressive in their audit posture, their audit policies. Others, we have seen examples where they really question the effective date of your registration. So when you're filling out your sales tax registration, there's always a field there that says, what is the date you began business? And we have seen examples of states come in and really challenge and question that, because they know it's easier to create nexus now. And so just be aware that that opportunity does exist when you're evaluating these options on what to do with your exposure. So with these direct-to-consumer retailers, there's often an exit strategy. They start this business, it goes great, but they always have in the back of their minds, I want to sell this. Maybe it's 3 years, 5 years, 10. Whatever the case is, it is extremely important to consider what your filing obligations are now. Do you have exposure, and how is that all going to tie together if and when the day comes to sell that business? I've seen examples of clients, because I get involved on the due diligence. I've seen examples of clients that wanted to sell, but they did not address that exposure they had. So all of this exposure, it was never remediated with a voluntary disclosure or anything like that. So it came up in the due diligence process, and there was escrows and indemnifications that were brought to the table. And so the biggest thing to consider is really getting a clean slate, taking care of the exposure so that it doesn't come up down the road when it comes time to sell the business.